The morning her father opened the door and found a cowboy standing in the rain, hat in hand, boots caked in mud, not a dollar to his name. Clara Whitmore pressed herself against the kitchen wall and stopped breathing. She had heard what men said about her: too big, too plain, too much. She had stopped believing anyone would ever come. But he had come. If this story touches your heart, please subscribe to our channel, follow Clara's journey all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1883 had been brutal to Millhaven, Texas, the kind of summer that cracked the earth open and left it bleeding dust. The kind that made ranchers wake at 3 in the morning just to count their cattle and pray none had dropped in the night. Wells ran shallow, tempers ran hot, and the town, as it always did when things got hard, turned its cruelty toward whoever was easiest to wound. In Millhaven, that had always been Clara Whitmore. She was 24 years old, soft brown hair that caught the light when she stepped outside, eyes the color of still river water, green and gray, and complicated, the kind of eyes that held things they never said out loud. Her face was round and lovely, in the way that sunsets are lovely, generously, without apology. But Clara was a large woman, full-figured, heavy in the way that a town like Millhaven could not forgive, because small towns need someone to look down on, and Clara had spent the better part of her life filling that particular role. She knew what they said. She had heard it since she was old enough to understand words. Too big for any man to want her. That was Mrs. Dobbins at the dry goods store, saying it loud enough that Clara could hear through the cracked window while she waited outside with her father's order. Pretty face, such a shame. That was Reverend Alcott's wife, who smiled at Clara every Sunday and whispered that sentence the moment Clara turned away. She'll die alone on that ranch. That was just about everyone. Clara had learned to carry those words the way she carried everything else, quietly in the wide space of her chest, pressing them down beneath the work that needed doing. Because there was always work. Her father, Thomas Whitmore, was 61 years old and moving slower every season. The ranch, 40 acres of stubborn Texas land, needed 2 strong people to run it, and most days it only had 1. Clara never complained. She rose before the sun. She fed the horses. She checked the fences. She hauled water from the well before the heat made it miserable. She cooked. She repaired. She made decisions that most men twice her age would have struggled with, and she made them alone, because the town had decided she wasn't worth consulting. That morning, the morning that would change everything, began like every other morning. Clara was in the barn, working on the east fence latch that had been sticking since February. She had her sleeves rolled to her elbows, her hands wrapped around a rusted bolt, sweat already forming at her collar, though the sun had barely crested the ridge. She was muttering to herself, a habit she'd developed from too many years of no one to talk to, when she heard the sound of hoofbeats coming up the road. She didn't look up immediately. Travelers passed through sometimes. Usually they kept going. But these hoofbeats slowed and stopped. Clara set down her wrench and walked to the barn door. There was a man on a horse at the edge of her family's property, looking at the gate like he was deciding whether he had the right to open it. He was tall, even from a distance, broad in the shoulders, lean everywhere else, with the kind of posture that came from years of hard riding. His hat was dark and weather-beaten. His coat had seen too many seasons. The horse beneath him was a good one, though a dark bay with clean legs, well kept, despite everything else that looked worn about the man. He noticed her standing in the barn doorway and touched the brim of his hat. She didn't move. He opened the gate anyway and came through slowly, which she noted. A man with bad intentions didn't move slowly. He moved like he wasn't sure he was welcome, and she found herself watching him all the way up the drive until he stopped a respectful distance from where she stood. "Morning, miss," he said. His voice was low, measured. Texas-born by the sound of it, though roughed up by years somewhere farther west. "Morning," Clara said. "I'm looking for Thomas Whitmore. I was told in town he might be needing ranch help." Clara studied him. He met her eyes without flinching, which already made him different from most men who came to the property. Most of them looked past her or around her, or at some point just above her shoulder, as if looking directly at her was an effort they'd rather skip. "My father's inside," she said. "I'll tell him you're here. What's your name?" "Jesse Calloway," he said. "Wait here," she said. She didn't hurry. She walked back through the barn and into the house with the same unhurried pace she used for everything. Because Clara Whitmore had learned a long time ago that rushing for people who might reject you was a fast way to exhaust yourself. Her father was at this kitchen table drinking coffee and reading last week's newspaper. He looked up when she came in. "Man outside," she said. "Says he's looking for ranch work. Name's Jesse Calloway." Thomas set down his coffee. "What's he look like?" "Honest," Clara said, surprising herself. Her father raised an eyebrow. "He moved slow coming through the gate," she said by way of explanation. Thomas nodded slowly, the way he considered everything these days, and pushed himself to his feet. "I was a big man gone thin," her father. Wide shoulders that no longer filled his shirts. But he still carried himself with the particular dignity of a man who had built something from nothing and intended to die knowing it. He walked outside and Clara followed. Jesse Calloway was still sitting on his horse exactly where she'd left him, which was another thing she noted. He hadn't moved around, hadn't poked at anything, hadn't tried to look busy or impressive. He was just waiting, hat still on, hands easy on the reins. "Jesse Calloway," her father said, not a question. "Yes, sir." Jesse swung down from the saddle in one smooth motion and stood with his hat in his hands, taller than she'd gauged from the barn, maybe 6 feet, maybe a hair over. "I heard you might be needing an extra hand. I'm a hard worker. I don't drink on the job. I know cattle and horses both. I can repair most things that break on a ranch." "What brings you to Millhaven?" Thomas asked. A pause. Not an evasive one, a careful one, like a man measuring what was true against what was easy. "Looking for somewhere to settle," Jesse said. "I've been moving a long time. I'd like to stop." Thomas looked at him for a long moment. Long enough that most men would have started talking to fill the silence. Jesse didn't. "I can't pay much," Thomas said finally. "I don't need much," Jesse said. "Room and board and fair wages, whatever the work is worth." Thomas looked at Clara. Clara looked at Jesse. Jesse looked at Clara and then back at Thomas, because that was the polite thing to do, and he seemed to understand it. "Come in for coffee," Thomas said. "We'll talk." Jesse Calloway had come to Millhaven from a place called Grief. I didn't put it that way. He wasn't a man who used words like grief out loud, but Clara understood it within the first hour of sitting at that kitchen table, listening to him answer her father's careful questions. He was 36 years old. He had worked cattle ranches across 3 territories. He had no family living. He had been engaged once years ago to a woman who died of fever before they married. He had spent the years since moving from one place to another, not running from her memory exactly, but not staying anywhere long enough for a new one to take root. He answered every question directly. He didn't embellish. He didn't ask for sympathy. When Thomas mentioned that the work would be heavy in the summer heat, Jesse just said, "That's all right. I work better when I'm tired." Clara sat at the far end of the table with her coffee and said nothing, which was her habit. She watched people when she was quiet. She learned more that way than she ever did by talking. What she learned about Jesse Calloway in that first hour, he looked at her father when he spoke, not past him. He noticed her coffee cup was empty and gestured toward the pot without being asked. When her father's breathing got rough, Thomas had a chest that had never fully recovered from a bad winter 2 years back. Jesse waited without comment while the older man collected himself, not pretending not to notice, not making a fuss about it either. He was, Clara thought, a man who paid attention to people. That was rarer than it should have been. Her father hired him before the coffee was finished. The town heard about it by nightfall. In Millhaven, everything traveled faster than news ought to. Clara had made it to the dry goods store and back before Mrs. Dobbins had already rearranged the information into something more entertaining. Thomas Whitmore hired some drifter, she told the 3 women gathered near the bolts of calico. No family, no references, just rode in off the road. "Who's going to watch him?" one of the women asked. "That's what I said," Mrs. Dobbins agreed. "And with only that poor girl there." Clara picked up her parcel from the counter. She had learned not to respond. Responding meant they won twice, once when they said it, and again when it proved she'd heard. She walked out without looking at them. But on the boardwalk outside, she stopped, because Jesse Calloway was standing 20 feet away, and between him and the door of the feed store stood two men she knew well. Hank Pruitt and Dale Mercer. Brothers, both of them. The kind of men who were only brave in groups and only funny when someone smaller was the joke. Hank was saying something. She couldn't hear it at this distance, but she could see the shape of it, the wide grin, the tilted head, the gesture toward the general direction of the Whitmore ranch. Jesse's face was still. Completely still, the way a river goes still before it bends. Dale said something and laughed. Jesse said something back. Clara moved closer without quite deciding to. She was near enough now to hear Dale saying, "The Whitmore girl. Big as a barn and twice as empty. That's who you'll be working for." He slapped Hank's arm. "Good luck finding anything worth looking at out there." Hank laughed so hard, he bent forward. Jesse didn't laugh. He looked at Dale with those steady eyes and said, "I've worked a lot of ranches. Never once found the cattle doing the appraising." Silence. Hank straightened up. Dale's smile fell off his face like something knocked from a shelf. Jesse held the look for one more second, then picked up his feed sack and walked away. Clara stepped back before he turned and saw her. She didn't want him to think she needed rescuing. She didn't want him to see that her hands had gone cold at what she'd just heard. Not because of what Dale had said she'd heard worse, but because of what Jesse had said back. She stood on the boardwalk until her breathing settled. Then she went home. The first week, Jesse worked without speaking much. He arrived before Clara in the morning. She noticed his boots on the porch each dawn before she'd gotten to the barn. He fixed the east fence she'd been struggling with in under an hour. He assessed every structure on the property with the quiet thoroughness of a man who understood that a ranch's problems never announced themselves until they became emergencies, and then said to Thomas one evening at supper, "Your water trough's got a slow leak under the east corner. I can patch it tomorrow if you want." Thomas looked at Clara. Clara had known about that leak for 3 weeks and had been rationing the repair around 30 other tasks. She nodded once carefully. "Do it," Thomas said. The next morning, Jesse patched the trough. He also, without being asked, replaced 2 rotting boards on the cattle pen. Clara watched him work from across the yard, and she thought, he does a thing because it needs doing, not because someone's watching. That struck her deeply. She had spent her life in a town that only noticed what people looked like. The idea that a man might simply move through the world, fixing what was broken because it was broken. It settled in her chest, like something she hadn't known was missing. She brought him water mid-morning because the heat was relentless, and she brought water to everyone who worked in it. She set it down beside him and started to turn away. "Miss Whitmore," he said. She turned back. I was looking at her, not the work, not the trough, not some point behind her shoulder. At her. "How long has that fence in the south pasture been leaning?" She blinked. "About 2 months, since the last big wind." He nodded. "I'll get to it tomorrow." "You don't have to." "I know," he said. "I want to." She didn't know what to say to that. So she said, "Thank you," and walked back to the house and stood at the kitchen window for a moment before she remembered she had things to do. On the 9th day of Jesse working the Whitmore ranch, Clara made the mistake of going into town on a Saturday. Saturday was the worst day. The street filled up. Everyone was out. And Millhaven on a Saturday felt like a place that was specifically designed to remind her of everything she was not. She kept her head down. She moved quickly. She was almost to the general store when she heard the voice. Well, look at this. Margaret Pruitt, Hank's wife, standing with 2 other women outside the milliner's shop, all 3 of them looking directly at Clara with the particular bright-eyed interest of women who have found something to discuss. Clara didn't stop walking. "Clara Whitmore," Margaret called out. "I hear you've got a man working the ranch." Clara stopped. She was never sure afterward why she stopped. She had learned not to, but something in Margaret's voice, the sweetness of it, the way it was pitched to carry, made her feet slow without her permission. "Jesse Calloway." Margaret continued, coming off the boardwalk with the other two close behind. Drifter, no family, no land. He works for my father, Clara said. Of course he does. Margaret's smile was kind, the way a trap is kind, perfectly shaped, designed to look like something else. I just hope you're being realistic, honey. A man like that working for a family like yours, people talk. People always talk, Clara said. They do, Margaret agreed. They say a woman in your position ought to be careful. A pretty face only carries so far. One of the other women made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Clara felt the familiar cold of it move through her, that particular chill that came not from the words themselves, but from the knowledge that the words were true to them, that they had genuinely calculated her worth and found it small. She was trying to find something to say, something that would close this without giving them more to work with, when she heard boots on the boardwalk. Jesse came around this corner from the feed store with a sack over one shoulder and stopped when he saw the grouping. He read it immediately. Clara could see him read it, the way his eyes moved from her face to the women in back, catching something in the set of her jaw or the stillness of her hands. He walked over. Miss Whitmore, he said. Your father asked me to find you when I was done at the store. You ready to head back? She looked at him. He was offering her something she understood, that. A door. An exit that required nothing from her except to walk through it. Yes, she said. I'm done here. She walked with him back to the wagon. She could feel Margaret Pruitt's eyes on her back the whole way. When they were out of range, she expected Jesse to say something kind or practical, some comment to fill the space. He didn't. He helped her up onto the wagon, climbed up himself, clicked the horse forward, and said nothing. After a moment, Clara said quietly, I didn't need saving. No, ma'am, he said. You didn't. Then why? Because they were enjoying it, Jesse said. And you didn't deserve an audience. She sat with that for a long moment. Then she said, Thank you. He nodded once and kept his eyes on the road. That was the day things between them shifted. Not toward anything dramatic, not toward anything she could name, just shifted. The way a temperature shifts in the late afternoon, almost imperceptible until you suddenly realize you're no longer warm. She started talking to him during the work. Small things at first. Questions about the cattle. Observations about the fences. He answered honestly and asked his own questions back about the ranch, about what had worked in previous summers, about the water sources when the creek ran low. He listened to her answers with the same attention he gave to everything, and she found herself saying things she hadn't said out loud in years. Ideas about how to rotate the grazing. A theory she'd had about the East Well's depth. A plan for the root cellar she'd been meaning to implement for 3 seasons. I didn't dismiss any of it. That's a good idea, he said once about the well. I'd start there. You think it would work? I think you've been running this ranch mostly alone for a while, he said. And it's still standing. So yes, I think your ideas work. Clara didn't respond immediately, because no one had ever said that to her before. Not like that. Not plainly the way he said things, as simple fact, not as encouragement meant to be kind. Later that evening, after Jessie had gone to the bunkhouse and her father had gone to bed, Clara sat on the porch in the cooling dark and thought about a life in which someone looked at what you'd built and said it's still standing. She didn't cry. She was too tired for that, and besides, the feeling wasn't sadness exactly. It was something more like recognition. Thomas Whitmore was not a foolish man. He had watched Jesse Calloway for 2 weeks before he said anything. He had watched his daughter too, the way she moved differently in the mornings, with a little more purpose than the grinding determination he was used to seeing. The way she mentioned Jesse's name in passing, not deliberately, the way you mention something you're not yet conscious of mentioning. He waited until a Sunday evening when Clara had gone out to check the horses, and Jesse was sitting on the porch step, whittling something small from a piece of cedar. Thomas lowered himself into his chair with the careful deliberateness of a man who no longer took standing and sitting for granted. "You got plans?" Thomas asked. Jesse looked up. "Sir." "Plans," Thomas said. "You told me you've been moving a long time. You looking to keep moving? Jesse set down his whittling. No, sir, I'm not. Then what are you looking for? A long pause. Honest, not evasive. I'm not entirely sure yet, Jesse said, but I think I'm starting to recognize it. Thomas looked at him steadily. The porch was quiet. The cattle were settling. The sky was going purple and gold in the west, the way Texas skies did in the summer evenings, dramatic and indifferent, beautiful, whether you looked at it or not. My daughter, Thomas said, is the finest person I have ever known. She has worked this ranch and kept my spirits and asked for nothing in return, because she loves this land and she loves me, and she is made of better material than most people ever come near. Jesse didn't look away. The town has treated her unkindly, Thomas continued voice level, for reasons that are their failure, not hers. She has carried that her whole life. I know, Jesse said quietly. Do you? Yes, sir, I do. Thomas studied him for another long moment. She doesn't need a man who thinks he's rescuing something, he said finally. She needs a man who's smart enough to recognize what he found. Jesse picked up his cedar piece again, turned it in his hands. I understand that, he said. Thomas nodded. He didn't say anything else. Neither did Jesse. But something was settled between them. Something that had no words, because it didn't need them, the way certain agreements between certain men don't. 3 days later, Jesse did something that Clara didn't expect. She had gone out to repair the gate on the south pasture, a two-person job she'd been doing alone for years by wedging a rock under one hinge and wrestling the other. She arrived to find Jesse already there, tools laid out, looking at the gate with the expression he used when he was calculating a problem. My father tell you? She asked. No, he said. I saw the rock trick last week. Figured you'd be out here eventually. She looked at the rock, then at him. You've been watching me work, she said. Not accusatory, just noting it. Yes, ma'am, he said. It didn't embarrass him. You know things about this ranch that I'll never know. Watching you is how I learn. She picked up her side of the gate. They worked in the easy silence she was becoming accustomed to with him, the kind that wasn't uncomfortable but was full, the way good silences are full. After a while, she said without looking up from the hinge, Why did you come to Millhaven specifically? Someone in the last town mentioned Thomas Whitmore had good land and needed help. People in that town talk about my father. People talk about this ranch, Jesse said. Said it used to be one of the best run in the county. Clara stilled slightly. Used to be, she said. Before Thomas got sick, he said simply. Before it got hard. She worked for a moment without answering. It'll be one of the best again, she said. It wasn't defensive. It was just true. She said it the way she said things she knew. Jesse looked at her over the gate. I believe that, he said. I believed it before I got here. The gate swung level. Clara stepped back and checked the line of it straight and clean. Good, she said, meaning the gate. But they both understood she might have meant something else entirely. The summer deepened. The heat pressed down on Millhaven like a hand. And in that heat, while the town watched and whispered and waited to see what would happen at the Whitmore ranch with the stranger who didn't know his place, Clara Whitmore, for the first time in 24 years, started to feel like someone who was exactly where she was supposed to be. She didn't name it. She was too careful for that. But in the mornings when she came out to find Jesse already working, and in the evenings when they sat with Thomas on the porch and talked about the work and the cattle and the things that needed doing, something in her that had been locked for a very long time began very slowly to open. It frightened her. She had spent years believing that certain things were not for her. Not because she had decided that no one decides that for themselves, but because enough people said it often enough and long enough that it became the air she breathed. Jesse Calloway was changing the air. Not through big gestures, not through speeches, through the ordinary, daily, unremarkable fact of treating her like someone worth treating well. And Clara Whitmore, who had survived almost everything the town had thrown at her, was starting to realize that the hardest thing she had ever faced was not their cruelty. It was the terrifying possibility that someone had seen through all of it. To her. and stayed. The shift happened so quietly that Clara almost missed it. One morning, a Tuesday, dry and breathless. The way all the mornings were that summer, she came out to the barn and found Jesse standing at the workbench with a piece of paper in his hand. Not reading it. Just holding it the way a person holds something they've read enough times to have memorized. She almost turned back. She had not made a habit of intruding on his quiet moments, because she understood the value of quiet moments in a way most people didn't. But he heard her step and looked up and folded the paper without hurrying. "Morning," he said. "Morning, morning," she said. "Everything all right?" A pause. Honest the way his pauses always were. "Letter from a man in Colorado," he said. "Old outfit I worked with. He's offering me a foreman position." Clara kept her face still. She was good at that. "That's a good position," she said. "It is," he said. He tucked the letter into his shirt pocket and turned back to the workbench, and Clara went about her morning, and neither of them said anything else about it for 3 days. But the letter sat between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending out rings that neither of them acknowledged. She didn't ask him what he intended to do. She had too much pride for that, and besides, she knew the answer she was afraid of. A man like Jesse Calloway, capable, steady, the kind of man who made every problem smaller just by being in the vicinity of it, did not belong on a struggling 40-acre ranch in Millhaven, Texas. He belonged somewhere larger, somewhere that could give him what he deserved. She understood that. She told herself she understood that. And she went on working. The problem was that Jesse went on working too. He did not mention the letter again. He repaired the south water trough and rebuilt the cattle pen gate and spent an entire afternoon on the roof of the smaller barn, fixing a section that had been leaking since before Clara could remember. He worked with the same unhurried focus he brought to everything. And when the day was done, he sat on the porch step with her father and talked about what needed doing next week and the week after that, like a man making plans. Clara watched from the kitchen doorway and thought, "He's still here," which was not a conclusion. It was just a fact. But it was a fact she found herself checking every morning like she checked the water levels and the cattle count. Still here, still here, still here. It became a rhythm under everything else. Then Margaret Pruitt came to the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon. Clara saw the buggy from the garden and felt the particular tension she always felt when certain people turned up uninvited, not fear exactly. More like the sensation of a storm front moving in. You know what's coming. You just don't know which part of it will hit. Margaret climbed down from the buggy in a dress that had no business being worn to a working ranch, and came up the walk with the bright, purposeful stride of a woman who had decided to do something and would not be deterred. "Clara," she said, "I hope I'm not interrupting." "You are," Clara said pleasantly, "but come in anyway." Margaret sat at the kitchen table and accepted coffee with the air of someone performing a social obligation rather than actually wanting coffee. She talked for several minutes about nothing. The heat, the summer social, a new family that had moved into the old Carson place, and Clara let her talk because she knew this was not what Margaret had come to say. Finally, Margaret set down her cup. "I'm going to be direct," she said. "I'd appreciate that," Clara said. "People are talking about Jesse Calloway," Margaret said. "About him being here, about the amount of time you two seem to be spending together." She paused as if gauging Clara's reaction, and when she got nothing, she pressed on. Clara, I'm saying this as someone who cares about your well-being. A man like that, a drifter, no roots, no land, he's not going to stay. And when he goes, the talk is going to be unkind." "The talk is already unkind," Clara said. Margaret blinked. "What I mean is—" "I know what you mean," Clara said. She kept her voice even, not angry, not defensive, just level the way she'd learned to be. "You mean that a man who actually treats me with respect must have an ulterior motive, because no man would do that otherwise. You mean that whatever happens, I'll end up looking foolish. And you mean that the kindest thing you can do is tell me so before it happens." Margaret opened her mouth. "I appreciate your concern," Clara said. "I really do. But I have been managing people's expectations of me since I was old enough to understand what those expectations were. I don't need help with that." A long silence. Margaret picked up her cup, set it down again. "You're a stubborn woman," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Clara agreed. "I am." Margaret left 20 minutes later, and Clara stood at the kitchen window and watched the buggy go. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. But something in her chest was beating a little harder than usual, because Margaret wasn't entirely wrong, and Clara knew it. She was afraid. Not of what the town would say. She had made her peace with that long ago. She was afraid of something much quieter than that. She was afraid of wanting something she had convinced herself she didn't want. She was afraid that Jesse Calloway had come into her life and cracked open something she had very carefully sealed, and that when he left, because men like him always moved on, she would not be able to seal it again. She washed Margaret's coffee cup. She went back to work. That was what she knew how to do. Jesse was at the cattle pen when she came through the yard running a check on the water levels, and he looked up when she passed and said, "Everything all right?" "Fine," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer than the question required. "Margaret Pruitt's buggy," he said. She come to warn you off something." Clara stopped walking. She turned to look at him, and he was watching her with those steady eyes, not unkind, not amused, just paying attention, the way he always paid attention. "Something like that," she said. Jesse nodded slowly, the way he absorbed information he'd already half anticipated. "What did you tell her?" he asked. "That I could manage my own expectations," Clara said. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. Something quieter than a smile and more serious. "That's true," he said. "You can." He went back to the water levels. Clara stood there for a moment longer than she needed to, then kept walking. That night, she sat on the porch after her father went to bed, which was a habit she'd had 4 years, the 1 hour of the day that was entirely hers. The heat had broken slightly with the evening, and the sky was enormous, the way Texas skies were enormous, and she was sitting with her coffee going cold in her hands when she heard the bunkhouse door. Jesse came out and stopped when he saw her. "Sorry," he said. "Didn't mean to intrude." "You're not," she said, because he wasn't. He sat on the step below her chair, a respectful distance, a considered position, and they were quiet for a while in the way that had become natural to them. And then, without looking at her, Jesse said, "I wrote back to the man in Colorado." Clara's hands tightened slightly on her cup. "What did you say?" she asked. "I said thank you," he said. And no, quiet. The night moved around them. "Why?" Clara asked carefully. Jesse was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Because I told your father I wasn't looking to keep moving, and I meant it." She didn't respond. She didn't trust herself to respond. After a moment she said, "That's a significant thing to turn down." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "It is." "You should be sure about it." He turned then and looked up at her, and in the dark she could see his face clearly enough to read what was in it, and what was in it was the same thing. It always was. Something settled and certain and unperformed. "I'm sure," he said. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked back at the sky. "All right," she said. It wasn't an answer. It wasn't a declaration. It was just the truth of how things stood acknowledged between them without ceremony, the way they acknowledged most things. She was still afraid. But something underneath the fear was quiet, in a way it hadn't been before. The ranch had that effect on her, she told herself. The night did. She almost believed it. The trouble started the following Saturday, and it started because of a man named Harlan Dodd. Harlan Dodd owned the biggest spread in the county, 400 acres of good cattle land north of town, and he was the kind of man who made sure everybody knew it. He was 52 years old, heavy in the jaw and the gut, with a salesman's smile, and the particular confidence of a person who had never once been told no by anyone who mattered. Clara had known him her whole life. She had never liked him. She had never had cause to say so directly, because Harlan Dodd had never paid her enough attention to merit a direct response. She was to him the way she was to most of Millhaven background. Furniture. A fixture of the landscape you acknowledged without seeing. Until Jesse Calloway started working at the Whitmore Ranch. And then apparently Clara Whitmore became interesting. She didn't understand it at first. She understood it on the Saturday afternoon when Harlan rode up to the ranch with two of his men, and a smile she didn't trust, tipped his hat and asked to speak with Thomas. Her father came out. Harlan made polite conversation for several minutes. The cattle, the summer, the drought that everyone was now starting to quietly worry about. And then, with the easy casualness of a man playing cards, "He knows are good," said, "Thomas, I've been thinking. You've got good land here, good location, and it's clear managing it is getting hard." He paused. "I'd be willing to make you a fair offer." Thomas looked at him. "I'm not selling," Thomas said. "I haven't named a price yet," Harlan said pleasantly. "Doesn't matter," Thomas said. Harlan's smile didn't change, but something behind it did. He glanced toward Clara, who was standing near the barn door, and then toward the bunkhouse where Jesse had just appeared in the doorway, taking in the situation. "A man working he can't manage isn't doing himself any favors," Harlan said. "And with all due respect, Thomas, you've got a daughter who's going to be running this alone before long. What's she going to do with 40 acres? "Same thing she's always done," Thomas said. "Manage them." Harlan looked at Clara again. This time it was not the look that dismissed her. It was a different look, measuring, and not in a way she liked. "Clara," he said, "you're a sensible woman. What do you think?" She met his eyes. "I think my father gave you his answer." Harlan held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked at Jesse, who had come down from the bunkhouse and was now standing in the yard, hands loose at his sides, expression entirely neutral. "Your ranch hand?" Harlan asked, tilting his head at Jesse. "Jesse Calloway," Clara said. Harlan looked at Jesse the way a man looks at something he's categorizing. "You got a stake in this property, Calloway?" "No, sir," Jesse said. "I work here." "Then this doesn't concern you?" "No, sir," Jesse said. "It doesn't." But he didn't move. Harlan studied him for another moment. Then he looked back at Thomas and pulled out a card from his breast pocket and held it out. "Think on it," he said. "The offer's fair. Better than what you'd get if things keep going the way they're going." Thomas took the card. He looked at it. He put it in his pocket. "I'll think on it," he said. Which was not what he meant. But it closed the conversation cleanly enough that Harlan could ride away without losing face, which seemed to be what mattered to him. The buggy went down the drive. When it was gone, Thomas let out a long breath and looked at his daughter. "You all right?" he asked. "Fine," she said. "Are you?" "I'm fine," he said. But he looked older. He looked tired the way he looked when something had cost him more than he showed. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about what Harlan Dodd had said, not the offer, because that was simple enough to dismiss. But the thing underneath the offer, the implication that the ranch was already failing, that her father was already failing, that a woman like her alone on 40 acres was not a person in control of a future, but a problem waiting to be solved. She had heard versions of that her whole life. She had gotten better at not letting them in. But at 3 a.m. in the dark, they found the cracks. She got up before dawn the way she always did and went out to the barn. Jesse was already there, not working yet, sitting on the old stool near the door, drinking coffee from the tin cup he brought from the bunkhouse, looking at nothing in particular. He looked up when she came in. "Couldn't sleep either," he said. "Not a question." "No," she said. She poured herself coffee from the pot he'd already made and sat on the workbench across from him, and they were quiet. In the way they were quiet, not empty, not uncomfortable. Finally Clara said, "He's going to come back." "Yes, ma'am," Jesse said. "Men like that always do." "My father won't sell." "I know. But if things keep—" She stopped. Jesse waited. "The drought is getting worse," she said. "If we don't have enough water for the cattle through August, we'll have to sell some of the herd. Maybe a lot of it. And if we sell too much—" She stopped again. "Then you're short on income next year," Jesse said. "Yes." He set down his cup. "You mentioned your grandfather built a water system." She looked at him. She had mentioned it once weeks ago in passing. She had not expected him to remember. "He did," she said. "A channel. It ran from the upper creek to the east pasture. He built it in the drought of '61. But it hasn't been used in 30 years, and I don't know what condition it's in. You know where it is? I think so, she said. He left drawings, in the back of the account ledger. Jesse stood up. Show me, he said. She looked at him in the pale early light of the barn. He was not performing urgency. He was not trying to make himself useful for the sake of it. He had simply heard a problem and moved toward it the way he moved toward all problems, with the same unshowy readiness. Now, she said. If you know where the drawings are, he said, now's as good a time as any. She got the ledger. They spread it on the workbench in the barn, and Clara pointed out the hand-drawn lines her grandfather had made 60 years ago. Precise and careful, a man who had understood his own land. Jesse studied it without speaking for a long time. He asked 2 questions: how far from the upper creek to the east pasture, and whether the ground between was flat or sloped. Clara answered both. He nodded once. It could work, he said. The channel might be blocked or damaged, but if the original grade is still there, it could work. People won't believe it, Clara said. I mentioned it once a couple of years ago. My father's old hand laughed me out of the barn. Jesse looked up from the ledger. I believe it, he said. She held his gaze. She thought about Margaret Pruitt and Harlan Dodd, and every person who had ever looked at her, and calculated the ceiling above which she was not allowed to go. She thought about 24 years of being told in ways large and small and relentless that her ideas were not worth the air they took up. And she thought about this man standing in her barn at 5 in the morning, bent over a 60-year-old drawing, saying, I believe it like it was the most unremarkable thing in the world. All right, she said. Let's go look at it. They rode out to the upper creek before breakfast. The channel was there, buried under years of growth and debris, but structurally intact in the sections they could see. Jesse dropped to one knee in the dirt and dug down with his hands, checking the slope and the depth. And after a while, he stood up and wiped his hands on his jeans and said, 2 weeks, maybe 3, if we work it hard. You'd help? Clara asked. He looked at her like the question surprised him. Of course, he said. It's not your ranch, she said. No, he said. But it could be my home. He said it simply, without decoration, the way he said most true things. Clara looked at him across the dry grass of the upper pasture, with the early sun coming in sideways and the sound of the nearly empty creek running low between the rocks, and she thought, there it is. There it finally is. The thing she had been afraid to name. The thing she had been refusing to look at directly for 6 weeks. She looked at it now. Then she looked away, because she needed a moment, and Jesse seemed to understand that, because he turned and walked back toward the horses without pushing it. She stood for a moment with the dry wind on her face. Then she followed him. The next 2 weeks were the hardest she could remember, and also somehow among the best. They worked the channel in the early mornings before the heat became unbearable, and in the evenings after it broke. Thomas helped where he could, which was less than he wanted, and more than he should have given his chest. And Clara watched him from the corner of her eye and said nothing, because there were things her father needed to do for his own dignity, and she understood that. The work was brutal. The debris had compacted over decades into something almost solid in places. There were sections where the original stone walls had crumbled and needed rebuilding. Jesse worked without complaint, without posturing, without any of the performance that some men brought to physical labor as a way of proving something. He worked the way he did everything, with complete focus and no wasted motion. Clara worked beside him. Not behind him. Beside him. He noticed. She could tell he noticed by the way he adjusted, always including her indecisions, always turning when he had a question. Treating her knowledge of the land and the system as essential rather than supplementary. Twice she caught a mistake he was about to make in the channel grade, and both times he stopped immediately when she pointed it out and said, "You're right, good catch." He didn't say it the way people say it to be kind. He said it like a man who was genuinely glad to be working with someone who knew what they were doing. On the 11th day, Hank Pruitt and 2 other men from town rode out to see what was happening. They stood at the edge of the work and watched for a while without dismounting. And then Hank said, "What in the world are you people digging up?" "Water channel," Jesse said. He didn't look up from the stone he was resetting. "A water channel," Hank repeated. He looked at Clara. "This your idea?" "My grandfather's idea," Clara said. "I'm just finishing it." Hank looked at the channel. He looked at Jesse. He looked at Clara. His face ran through several expressions: skepticism, the urge to mock, and something else that she recognized as the beginning of uncertainty. Because it looked real. Whatever they were building, it looked like it might actually work. "Harlan Dodd's going to hear about this," Hank said finally. It was meant to be a threat. "I expect he will," Clara said. Hank and his men rode back to town. Jesse watched them go. Then he picked up his tool and went back to work. "You're not worried about Dodd?" Clara asked. "I'm more worried about this grade in Section 4, Jesse said. "Hand me that level." She handed it to him. She found herself smiling, which was not something she did easily or often. But it faded when her father collapsed 3 days later. It wasn't severe. Thomas would be the first to say it wasn't severe, and he said so repeatedly and forcefully from the moment Jesse got him inside and onto the bed. His breathing had finally caught up to all the pushing it had taken. The doctor came out from town and spent an hour with him and came out looking serious. "He needs rest," the doctor told Clara in the hallway. "Real rest, not whatever he's been doing." "He won't," she started. "He doesn't have a choice," the doctor said. Clara stood in the hallway and felt the weight of the ranch settle entirely onto her shoulders. She had carried most of it before, but there had always been her father, not always capable, not always well, but present. A hand on the other end of whatever she was carrying. She stood very still in that hallway. Jesse appeared at the end of it. "I didn't say anything." He looked at her face and read what was in it, and then he said, "The channel's almost done. 2 more days, maybe 3. She understood what he was telling her. He was telling her to hold on. "My father can't." "I know," Jesse said. "That's all right. I've got it." "Jesse." She stopped. "You can't do it alone." "I'm not alone," he said. "You're here." She looked at him. Her hands were cold. Her chest was tight. She was trying very hard not to show how frightened she was because she had learned over a long life that showing fear gave it too much room. "I don't know if the channel will be enough," she said quietly. "Even if it works, even if it brings water to the east pasture, I don't know if it's enough to get through August. The herd's already stressed. If we lose more than a dozen head, then we deal with that when it happens," Jesse said. "Right now we finish the channel." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she nodded. She went to sit with her father. Jesse went back to work. That night after Thomas was sleeping and the house was quiet, Clara sat at the kitchen table with the account ledger open in front of her. Not the old one with the grandfather's drawings. The current one. The one with the numbers. The numbers were not good. She had known that. She had known it for a year, maybe more. But knowing a thing and seeing it written in ink were different experiences. And she sat with the difference for a while in the quiet kitchen, with the lamp turned low and the night pressing in at the windows. She heard boots on the porch. A knock at the door, light not urgent. She opened it. Jesse stood there with his hat in his hands and a look on his face she hadn't seen before. Not the settled certainty. Something more careful than that. "I found something," he said. "In Section 6 of the channel. You need to see it." She didn't ask questions. She pulled on her boots and followed him out into the dark. He had a lantern. He led her out to the channel, to the section they'd been working on that afternoon. He crouched down and held the lantern low, and Clara crouched beside him, and in the light she could see what he'd found. Her grandfather's original stonework, completely intact. A full 12-foot section, perfectly preserved. The stone fitted so precisely that 60 years of Texas earth had not moved it an inch. She put her hand on it. The stone was cool, solid. "He built it right?" Jesse said quietly. "Your grandfather. He built it to last." She kept her hand on the stone. She was not going to cry. She was absolutely not going to cry, because Clara Whitmore had not cried in front of anyone in years, and she was not about to start in a ditch at midnight. But something happened in her face that she couldn't entirely stop, and Jesse being Jesse saw it and said nothing, and just held the lantern steady. After a moment she said, "He was a stubborn old man, everyone said so." "Good kind of stubborn," Jesse said. "Yes," she said. "The best kind." She stood up, brushed the dirt from her hands. "2 more days," she said. "2 more days," he agreed. She started back toward the house. She had gone about 20 feet when she heard him say her name, not Miss Whitmore, just Clara, and she stopped. She turned. I was still crouching by the channel lantern in hand, looking at her across the dark yard. "Whatever happens with the channel," he said. "Whatever happens with the herd, or the drought, or Harlan Dodd." He paused. "I'm not going anywhere." She stood very still. "You don't have to say that," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I'm saying it." She looked at him for a long moment. At this man in a ditch in the middle of the night, holding a lantern over her grandfather's stonework, telling her in the plainest possible terms that he intended to stay. She thought about everything she had been taught to believe about herself. All the versions of not enough and too much, and no one will that had been layered into her over 24 years, until they felt like facts instead of cruelties. She thought about her grandfather, who had built something that lasted 60 years. She thought about her father, who had built something worth fighting for. She thought maybe building things is what the Whitmore women do. Maybe I've been building too and didn't know it. "All right," she said. She went inside. She did not sleep much. But for the first time in a long time, the numbers in the ledger did not feel like the whole story. The channel opened on a Thursday morning, and it worked. Clara stood at the east pasture gate and watched the water move through her grandfather's stonework and into the dry trough, and she did not say anything for a long time. Jesse stood a few feet behind her. Thomas was on the porch, too weak to come out, but close enough to see, and when the water reached the trough and the cattle moved toward it with that particular urgency of animals that have been waiting. Clara heard her father make a sound from the porch that she had not heard from him in a very long time, something between a laugh and a breath. She turned and looked at Jesse. He was watching her, not the water. "It worked," she said. "You said it would," he said. She turned back to the trough. The cattle were drinking. The water was steady and clean, running down the grade her grandfather had calculated 60 years ago with nothing but math and knowledge and the stubborn certainty that it was possible. She pressed her hand flat against the top of the stone wall. "Thank you," she said, quietly, meaning more than the channel. "You did most of it," Jesse said. "You believed it would work when nobody else did." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That's the easy part. When something's true, believing it isn't hard." She didn't answer, but she kept her hand on the stone for another long moment before she turned and walked back toward the house, and when she passed the porch, her father reached out and touched her arm and said nothing at all, and that said everything. The news reached town by afternoon. Clara had not planned to tell anyone. She had not planned anything except to keep working and keep the cattle watered and get through August with enough of the herd intact to matter. But Hank Pruitt had apparently ridden out that morning on some errand of his own and had seen the water running in the east pasture, and by dinner time 3 ranchers had sent word asking how she'd done it. She didn't answer immediately. She was sitting with her father at the kitchen table when Jesse came in from the yard and set his hat on the hook by the door and said, "You've got company coming." "Who?" "Ed Garrity and Frank Hollis," he said, riding up the south road. Thomas looked at Clara. Clara looked at the door. Ed Garrity ran the second largest spread in the county. Frank Hollis ran the third. Both of them had ignored the Whitmore ranch for years. Not maliciously, just thoroughly, the way prosperous people ignore the struggling ones without even deciding to. They had also, Clara recalled very clearly, been present at the feed store 2 years ago when she had first mentioned her grandfather's channel and been laughed out of the conversation. She stood up. "I'll go out," she said. "I'll come with you," Thomas said. "You'll stay inside," she said. "Doctor's orders." She went out alone. Garrity and Hollis dismounted at the gate with the careful courtesy of men who needed something. Clara recognized that courtesy, It was different from the ordinary kind, softer around the edges, shaped by want. "Miss Whitmore," Garrity said. He was a big red-faced man with a handlebar mustache and the particular manner of someone not accustomed to asking. "We heard about your water channel." "Did you?" Clara said. "We did," Hollis said. He was thinner, quieter, with the look of a man who chose his words carefully and resented needing to choose them now. "Our east pastures are running dry. 3 other ranchers in the same situation." Clara looked at him steadily. "I seem to recall," she said, "that the last time I mentioned this channel, the general response was that a woman shouldn't concern herself with ranch engineering." Garrity had the grace to look uncomfortable. Hollis looked at his hat brim. "That was a mistake," Hollis said. "On our part." "Yes," Clara said. "It was." She let that sit for a moment. Then, "Come inside. I'll show you my grandfather's drawings." She showed them. She explained the grade system, the stone construction, the water source. She answered questions clearly and without embellishment, and when Garrity asked twice if she was certain about the numbers, she said both times, yes, without adding anything to soften it. Jesse sat at the far end of the table and said nothing. He was there because he understood these things, and because if technical questions came up, she might need him. He did not speak unless she looked at him. When she looked at him, checking a measurement from the drawing, he gave the number immediately and without preamble. Garrity and Hollis left with copies of the drawings and a promise to send help if any labor was needed to extend the channel When they were gone, Thomas called from the bedroom. "Well, they're going to try it," Clara called back. A pause. "Did they apologize?" Thomas asked. "Sort of," she said. "Good enough," he said. Jesse picked up the lantern from the table and said, "You handled that well." "I was angry," she admitted. "I know," he said. "You hit it completely." She looked at him. "Is that a compliment?" "It's an observation," he said. "The compliment is that you were right and you knew it and you didn't need them to admit it before you helped them. That takes character." She didn't have an answer for that. She went to check on her father. She was getting better at not having answers when Jesse said true things about her. Not because the words were unwelcome, but because they required a response she hadn't yet figured out how to give, and she refused to give a false one. The following Monday, Harlan Dodd came back. This time he didn't send advance notice. He rode up with 4 men, not ranch hands. Something else men with a certain quality of stillness that Clara recognized as hired and dismounted at the gate with the same pleasant expression he always wore, which had begun to remind her of a brand new trap. Jesse was at the barn. He came out when he heard the horses. Harlan looked at him, then at Clara, then at Thomas on the porch. "Thomas," he said, "feeling any better?" "Better than I look," Thomas said. "Glad to hear it." Harlan's eyes moved over the property with the practiced assessment of a man calculating value. They landed on the east pasture where the cattle were grazing in the green that had started to return now that the water was running. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "Heard about your water system," he said to Clara. "Word travels fast," she said. "It does," he smiled. "I also heard you've been helping Garrity and Hollis with their pastures." "I shared information," she said. "That's not the same thing." "No," he agreed. "But it shows community spirit." He paused, letting that land like it was a compliment, then continued. "I've been thinking, Clara. What you've done here is impressive, genuinely. I underestimated this ranch." He spread his hands in a gesture of transparency. "I'd like to make a new offer. A partnership, not a sale. You keep the name, keep running the day-to-day. I provide capital and stability." Clara looked at him. She understood what he was doing. The channel had changed her property's value and her standing in the community, and Harlan Dodd was recalibrating. He was not offering partnership because he respected her. He was offering partnership because he had miscalculated the price of the land and now wanted to reacquire it through a different door. "No thank you," she said. Harlan's smile stayed in place, but she could see the work it was taking. "You haven't heard the terms," he said. "I don't need to," she said. "This ranch isn't for sale, and it isn't for partnership." "Clara." His voice shifted, still pleasant, but with an edge underneath it now, like a knife in a drawer. "You're a practical woman. Your father isn't well. The drought isn't over. You've solved one problem, but there'll be others. A ranch this size run by—" He stopped himself. "By who?" she said. He recalibrated again. "By two people and a hired hand." "Then say that," she said. "Don't start a sentence you won't finish." A silence fell over the yard. Jesse had moved without appearing to move to a position slightly forward and to Clara's left. He was not threatening. He was not posturing. He was simply there in the way that certain presences are simply there, solid, deliberate, impossible to ignore. One of Harlan's men shifted in his saddle. Harlan looked at Jesse. "You got something to add, Calloway?" "No, sir," Jesse said. "Miss Whitmore seems to be handling it." "She is," Harlan said. "I just wonder if she understands what she's handling." He looked back at Clara. "I know people in the county land office. I know people on the bank board. That's not a threat, that's just information." "I have information too," Clara said. "I know this land. I know this water system. I know every acre of this ranch and what it's worth and what it can produce." She held his gaze. "And I know the difference between a man who wants a partner and a man who wants to own something he couldn't take any other way." The four men behind Harlan were very still. Harlan looked at her for a long moment with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not anger, something more calculated than anger. Assessment. The way a man looks at something he's realized he's been wrong about. "You've changed," he said finally. "No," she said. "You just weren't paying attention before." He put his hat back on. "I'll be in touch," he said. "You can try," she said. He rode out. When the sound of hoofbeats faded, Clara became aware that her legs were not entirely steady. She had not shown it. She was quite certain she had not shown it. But the moment Harlan's dust disappeared down the road, she sat down on the porch step because standing suddenly required more effort than she had available. Thomas looked at her from his chair. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "Give me a minute." Jesse crouched beside the step. I didn't say anything. He was just there in the same way he'd been there in the yard, solid and present, and not requiring anything from her. After a moment, she said, "He's going to do something." "Yes," Jesse said. "What?" "I don't know yet," he said. "But men like that don't go away clean." She nodded. "We need to be ready," she said. "We will be," he said. She looked at him sideways. "How are you so calm?" "I've dealt with men like Harlan Dodd before," Jesse said. "They're powerful right up until the thing they're threatening doesn't scare you anymore. Then they're just loud." She thought about that. "What if I'm scared?" she said. It was the most unguarded thing she had said to him. He looked at her steadily. "Then you're scared and you do it anyway, which is what you've been doing your whole life." She sat with that for a moment. Then she stood up, brushed off her skirt, and went inside to check on her father. The thing Harlan did came 5 days later, and it came through the bank. A letter arrived for Thomas Whitmore from the First Territorial Bank of Millhaven. Clara opened it because Thomas was having a bad morning with his chest, and the letter informed Thomas that based on a review of current land valuations and outstanding accounts, the bank was requesting full repayment of the outstanding balance of the Whitmore property loan within 60 days. Clara read it twice. Then she sat down. The loan had been in place for 11 years. It had always been managed quietly, paid on time in smaller installments, never called in. Calling it in full in 60 days in the middle of a drought, it was not standard practice. It was pressure. Shaped like paperwork, but pressure. She folded the letter very carefully. She put it in her apron pocket. She went and sat with her father until his breathing settled and he fell into a light sleep, and then she went to the kitchen table and opened the account ledger and did the numbers for the 4th time that week, hoping they would change. They didn't. Jesse found her there an hour later. He came in for water, saw her face, and sat down across from her without being invited. "Tell me," he said. She told him. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. "Harlan," he said. It wasn't a question. He said he knew people on the bank board, she said. Yes. Jesse turned the information over the way. He turned problems over without panic, with the careful thoroughness of a man who needed to understand a thing before he reacted to it. How much and how long? She told him the amount. He was quiet again. I have some money put aside, he said. She looked up sharply. Jesse. Not enough, he said. Not close to enough. But some. He paused. Garrity and Hollis owe you something for the channel drawings. Not legally, but they know it. And there are 3 other ranchers who've come around since the water started running. He looked at her. You've spent your whole life being owed and never collecting. I think it's time to ask. I am not going to beg from my neighbors, she said. It's not begging, he said. You helped them. They help you. That's how a community is supposed to work. Millhaven just forgot that for a while. She stared at him. You make it sound simple, she said. The asking is simple, he said. The hard part is believing you're worth asking for. The words landed in the center of her chest. She looked down at the ledger. She thought about 24 years of making herself smaller, of anticipating rejection so effectively that she had rejected herself first before anyone else got the chance, of deciding what was and wasn't available to her based on what other people's faces had told her over years of accumulated small cruelties. She thought about her grandfather, who had built a water channel and trusted it would last. She looked up. All right, she said. They rode out the next morning, Clara and Jesse both. She had written 3 letters the night before, not begging letters, not emotional letters, practical ones outlining what she needed, why and what she offered in return, access to the channel system water rights, her knowledge of the East pasture grades. Garrity said yes before she finished talking. Hollis took 20 minutes and a cup of coffee, but said yes. The 3rd rancher, old Pete Cavanaugh, who barely spoke to anyone but had been sending his men to quietly watch the channel work for 2 weeks, said yes without looking up from the fence post he was working on. Your granddaddy built good work, was all he said. Least we can do. She was back at the ranch by noon. She sat down and did the numbers again. With what Jesse had, with what the 3 ranchers had pledged, and with a careful restructuring of the next quarter's operating budget, it was not comfortable. It was not even close to comfortable. But it was enough. Barely contingently holding its breath enough. She put down the pencil. Jesse was watching her from across the table. We're not losing the ranch, she said. Something moved across his face. Not surprise he had believed it would work before they left that morning, but something like relief, which on Jesse looked like the easing of something he had been holding very carefully. Good, he said. She looked at him. She had been looking at him for 2 months and understanding different things each time. Right now, what she understood was this. He had come here with nothing. He had stayed when he had options. He had given what he had, his savings, his labor, his belief, without calculating the return. He had stood in her yard when Harlan Dodd arrived and placed himself in a position of protection so naturally that she had only recognized it afterward. She had never had that. She had never had someone simply place themselves on her side without her asking. Jesse, she said. What are you actually doing here? He looked at her steadily. Same thing you are, he said. Building something. She held his gaze. You know that's not what I mean, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I know. He set down his coffee cup. I came to Millhaven because someone told me Thomas Whitmore had good land and needed help. That was true, but it's not why I stayed. She waited. I stayed, he said slowly, like a man measuring words he'd been turning over for a while. Because I found a person who works harder than anyone I've ever met and gets less credit for it than anyone I've ever seen. Who has more sense and more courage and more plain human decency than this entire town put together. He paused. And because being around you makes me feel like the years of moving around didn't waste everything. Clara sat very still. She had heard things said to her in her life. Kind things and cruel things and everything between. She had learned to hold them all at a certain distance because distance was protection, and she had needed protection. She did not know how to hold this at a distance. "You're not saying this to be kind," she said. It came out very quiet. "No, ma'am," he said. "I'm not." She looked at her hands flat on the table. "I don't know what to do with that," she said honestly. "You don't have to do anything with it right now," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." She looked up. He was watching her with that settled, certain expression that she had stopped trying to read as anything other than exactly what it was. "You keep saying that," she said. "Because I keep meaning it," he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My father is going to ask you your intentions at some point." "I know," Jesse said. "I'm looking forward to it." Something moved through her that she did not have a word for. It was warm and frightening, and entirely against the grain of everything she had taught herself to expect. She stood up. "I need to check the east trough," she said. "I checked it this morning," he said. "It's fine." She stood there for a moment, needing to do something with her hands and having run out of reasonable tasks. "Then I need to," she started. "Clara," he said. She stopped. "It's all right," he said quietly. "Take your time." She sat back down. They finished their coffee in the easy silence that had always been theirs, and it was the same silence, and it was entirely different, and neither of them said anything else for a while, and that was all right too. The crisis came without warning on the last Wednesday of August, the way crises do not announced, not preceded by the courtesy of warning, just suddenly and completely present. Clara woke at 4 in the morning to the sound of cattle. Not the ordinary sound, the panicked kind. The sound that meant something was wrong in the herd. The sound that bypassed the brain and went directly to the body, and she was out of bed and pulling on her boots before she was fully awake. She hit the porch at the same time Jesse came out of the bunkhouse. The south pasture fence was down, not broken cut. 3 clean sections low to the ground, the kind of cut that takes tools and intention. And through the gap in the dark, the herd was moving. Not running yet, but beginning to shift with that collective animal intelligence that preceded panic, 50 head of cattle responding to something wrong in the air. "Jesse," she said. "I see it," he said. He was already moving toward the barn. "The Harlan. Later," he said. "Cattle first." They rode out into the dark together. Thomas awake on the porch, calling after them with instructions he knew they already knew. The next 2 hours were the hardest physical work Clara had done in years, riding pattern around a spooked and moving herd in the dark, working by instinct and sound, more than sight. Jesse's voice cutting through the noise with the calm authority of a man who had done this 100 times. He was extraordinary with the cattle. She had known he was good. She had not known he was this good, moving his horse with a precision that looked effortless, reading the herd's direction before it committed to it, placing himself exactly where the next break would come a full 10 seconds before it happened. She matched him as well as she could, and she was good too. This was her herd, her land. She knew every behavioral pattern of every animal, and together they held the line, and then they began to turn it, and then slowly, in the long gray period before dawn, the herd settled. Clara leaned over her horse's neck and breathed. She was shaking, not from cold. Jesse rode up beside her. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. Then, "Who does that? Who cuts a fence in the middle of the night?" "Someone who wanted to create a problem," Jesse said. "A bad enough problem that you'd be dealing with consequences for weeks." He paused. "Someone who knows you've just solved your water situation and decided to create a new crisis." "Harlan," she said. "Can't prove it," he said. "I know," she said. "But we both know." She looked at the broken fence in the early light. 47 of the 50 head were accounted for. She had 3 missing. In the dark in the 3 animals. Loose, a significant enough loss if they weren't found. And even if they were found, the fence would take a day to repair, and the herd would be stressed, and the whole operation would be set back by at least a week. She thought, this is what he wants. Not just the land. He wants me exhausted. He wants me making decisions from desperation. She straightened in the saddle. "Where would they go?" Jesse asked. "The 3 missing ones." "East," she said immediately. "There's a draw about a mile out. They go there when they're scared." "Show me," he said. She showed him. They found the 3 cattle in the draw, as she had said, and brought them back. And by the time the sun was fully up, they were riding into the yard to find Thomas on the porch and 2 of Pete Kavanaugh's ranch hands standing in the drive. "Pete sent us," one of the men said. "Heard there was trouble." Clara looked at them. She looked at Thomas. She looked at Jesse. "Word travels fast," she said for the second time that week. "Pete was up early," the man said. "Saw riders on the south road before dawn. He figured something was wrong." Jesse dismounted. He looked at Clara and said in a voice too quiet for the others to hear, "Harlan made a mistake." "What mistake?" she said. "He moved in the dark," Jesse said. "And people in this county are starting to pay attention to what happens to this ranch." He paused. "He thought you were alone. You're not anymore." She looked at Pete's men. She looked at the fence that would need repairing. She thought about the account ledger with the numbers that barely added up, and the water channel that her grandfather had built to last, and the cattle in the south pasture that were hers, that she had raised and known and cared for, and the ranch that was her father's life and her own, and everything that had been built here over 3 generations of stubborn, difficult, unglamorous work. She thought about Jesse Calloway, who had turned down a foreman's position in Colorado and stayed in a ditch in the middle of the night to hold a lantern over stone that had lasted 60 years. She dismounted. "Let's fix the fence," she said. They worked all morning. Pete's men worked alongside Jesse without being asked to do more than they'd come for, and then did more anyway. And by early afternoon, the south fence was rebuilt stronger than it had been before. Thomas sat on the porch and watched and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Jesse." Jesse looked up. "Come here a minute," Thomas said. Clara watched from the fence line as Jesse crossed the yard and stood at the foot of the porch steps. She was too far to hear the words clearly. She could see her father's face and Jesse's back. She could see the quality of the conversation, not brief, not casual. The kind of exchange that had weight. After a while, Jesse nodded. He nodded once more. Then he turned and came back across the yard, and when he reached Clara, he looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Something that sat very close to the surface, less controlled than his usual. "What did he say?" she asked. Jesse was quiet for a moment. He said, Jesse told her carefully, that you are the finest person he has ever known, and that any man who walks this land beside you should understand exactly what that means. Clara felt something move through her that she could not name and did not try to. She looked at her father on the porch. Thomas lifted one hand, just slightly, just enough. She looked back at the fence they had rebuilt. She thought built to last. She thought the best kind of stubborn. Then she picked up her tools and went back to work, and Jesse picked up his tools and worked beside her, and the sun moved across the Texas sky, and the cattle grazed in the south pasture, and the water ran steady and clean through her grandfather's channel. And somewhere in the middle of all of that ordinary, difficult, irreplaceable work, Clara Whitmore understood that something had changed. Not today, not all at once, but changed. The way a season changes so slowly, you can't mark the moment until you look up one morning and realize the whole world is different from what it was. She did not name it out loud. She didn't have to. Some things you know before you say them. And this was one of them. The fence repair held. 3 days passed without incident, which was the kind of quiet that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. Clara worked the ranch the way she always worked it, methodically without wasted motion, but she checked the south fence line twice a day now, once at dawn and once at dusk, and she noted that Jesse did the same without being asked. They didn't talk about Harlan Dodd directly. There wasn't much to say that they hadn't already said. But his name moved through the ranch like weather, not present, but influencing everything. On the 4th morning after the fence incident, a rider came from town with a letter addressed to Thomas Whitmore from the First Territorial Bank. Not the same kind of letter as before. This one was shorter. It confirmed receipt of the partial payment Clara had arranged through Garrity, Hollis and Kavanaugh and adjusted the repayment timeline accordingly. Clara read it standing at the kitchen counter. She read it a second time to be sure. Then she set it down and looked out the window at Jesse, who was working the water trough in the east pasture, moving with his usual unhurried purpose, the morning light long and flat across the yard. She thought, We bought time. Not victory. Time. She understood the difference. She took the letter to her father. Thomas read it with his reading glasses down his nose and his coffee going cold beside him, and when he finished, he set it on the blanket across his lap and said, "Harlan's going to try again." "I know," she said. "He doesn't lose gracefully," Thomas said. "No." Thomas looked at her over his glasses. "You're not scared?" It was half observation, half question. "I'm scared," she said. "I'm just not letting it run the ranch." He looked at her for a long moment, with the expression he wore when he was seeing her, rather than just looking at her. Something deep and quiet in it. The way fathers look at children who have become people right in front of them, without the fathers quite noticing when it happened. "Your mother would have liked him," Thomas said. Clara blinked. Her father had not mentioned her mother in months. "Jesse," she said. Thomas picked up his coffee. She had a gift for seeing what people were made of. Took her about 10 minutes with a person, and she was never wrong. He took a sip. She'd have had him figured out before he finished tying his horse. Clara sat down in the chair beside the bed. "What do you think she would have said?" she asked. Thomas smiled, the real one, the one that started slowly and reached his eyes. She would have said, "Thomas, that man has been waiting for your daughter his whole life without knowing it." Clara looked at her hands. "Papa," she said. "I'm not pushing," Thomas said. "I'm just telling you what I see, because I don't know how much more time I have to tell you things, and I'd rather say them than not." She looked up sharply. "You're not," she started. "I'm fine," he said. "For now. But I'm not stupid, Clara. My chest knows things my pride doesn't." He set down his cup. "I want to see you settled before I go. Not because I think you need a man. Lord knows you don't. But because you deserve to be loved by someone who deserves you. And that's rare. When it's right in front of you, you don't want to talk yourself out of it." She was quiet for a long time. The house made its small sounds around them. The settle of old wood, the wind at the window, the distant sound of the cattle. "I'm afraid," she said, very quietly. The same admission she had made to Jesse in the yard, and no easier for the repetition. "Of what?" Thomas asked. "That it's not that I've misread it. That when things settle down and there's no crisis holding us together, it will turn out to be—" She stopped. "Gratitude," Thomas said. "Yes, it's not gratitude," Thomas said flatly. "I've been watching that man for 2 months. He doesn't stay up half the night fixing fence because he's grateful. He stays because he doesn't want to be anywhere else." He looked at her steadily. "And I'm a good judge of character, Clara. I always have been. It's the one thing I'll boast about." She said nothing, but something in her chest loosened very slightly, the way a knot loosens when you work at it long enough. She kissed her father's forehead and went back to work. The week that followed was ordinary in the best sense of the word. The channel continued to run. The herd stabilized. Garrity sent word that his east pasture was showing improvement based on Clara's drainage recommendations, and Hollis stopped by in person to say the same. Old Pete Kavanaugh sent a jar of his wife's preserved peaches with no note, which was the most eloquent thing Pete had ever communicated. Clara began to breathe again. She had forgotten in the months of crisis what it felt like to work toward something instead of just away from disaster. The sensation was different in the body lighter somehow, despite the labor being identical. Jesse noticed. "You're sleeping better," he said one morning, not looking up from the gate hinge he was lubricating. "How would you know?" she said. "You come out to the barn later," he said. "Before it was before 5, now it's after." She looked at him. How was right? She had not noticed the shift herself. "That's a very precise observation," she said. "I told you," he said. "I pay attention." She handed him the oilcloth, and he took it without looking up, and their fingers touched briefly in the handoff, barely incidentally, and neither of them mentioned it. But she was aware of it for the rest of the morning, with a clarity that was completely disproportionate to how small it was. She was thinking about this later in the afternoon, while she was in the kitchen working on the accounts, when she heard a horse in the yard. Not Jesse's horse, not a horse she recognized. She went to the door. The man on the horse was young mid-20s, neatly dressed in town clothes rather than ranch gear, with the fresh-faced look of someone who had recently been given a job that required him to deliver bad news to people. He had a document in his hand. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm from the county assessor's office." He held out the document. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'm just delivering it." She took it. She did not open it in front of him. She waited until he had turned his horse and ridden back down the drive, and then she unfolded it and read it standing in the doorway, and by the time she reached the third paragraph, her hands had stopped being steady. A formal land assessment. Ordered by the county. Citing changes in property valuation requiring reevaluation of the Whitmore parcel and adjacent water rights. Water rights. Harlan had gone after the water. She understood it immediately and completely, not the fence this time. Not the bank. The water system. The channel ran across 3 property lines technically, because her grandfather had built it before the modern surveys were drawn. If someone challenged the water rights, if someone with influence at the county level forced a formal legal review, they could potentially claim the channel or the water source, or both. Harlan Dodd had found the seam in the stone. She stood in the doorway and made herself breathe. Then she went to find Jesse. He was at the cattle pen. He read the document without speaking, and she watched his face go through something. Not panic. Jesse did not panic, but a tightening around the eyes that told her he understood the severity. "This is smart," he said. "That's not reassuring," she said. "I know." He folded the document. "He can't take the ranch directly. He's tried the bank, he tried the fence, so now he's going at the thing that makes the ranch worth fighting for." He looked at her. "If he gets the water rights, he doesn't need to own your land. He just has to control what makes it viable." Clara sat down on the fence rail. She had not intended to sit down. Her legs simply made the decision without consulting her. "Can he do it?" she asked. "He can try," Jesse said. "Whether he succeeds depends on how good your grandfather's original land records are." She looked up. "I have the original survey," she said slowly. "My grandfather kept everything. All of it is in the chest in the back room." Jesse looked at her. "Everything," he said. "Every deed," she said. "Every boundary record. Every water agreement from when the county was first mapped." She was already moving. He kept it all. She went into the house. Jesse followed. She went to the back room, the room that had been her grandfather's office, and was now mostly storage, and opened the old wooden chest that sat under the window. She had not opened it in 2 years, maybe 3. It smelled like cedar and old paper. She began going through it. Jessie sat on the floor beside the chest without being asked and began handing her folders as she sorted reading the labels separating by date. An hour in, she found it. An 1851 land agreement signed by her grandfather and the county surveyor and 2 neighboring landowners. It documented the original water source, the Upper Creek, as belonging in perpetuity to the Whitmore parcel. It documented the channel right-of-way across the neighboring properties. It was witnessed, notarized, and filed with the territorial government. It was, as legal documents went about, as solid as her grandfather's stonework. Clara held it in both hands. Jesse leaned over to read it. He was very close. She could feel the warmth of him beside her in the small room, the familiar solid presence that she had stopped pretending she didn't notice. "That's it," he said quietly. "That's it," she agreed. She looked at it for a moment longer. Then she said, "My grandfather was a stubborn old man." "The best kind," Jesse said, the echo of what she'd said to him weeks ago at the channel in the dark. She looked at him. Howe was looking at the document, but he was smiling. The quiet kind of smile that was entirely his, the one that didn't advertise itself. She thought, "I love him." It arrived without warning, without ceremony. The way the simplest truths arrive, not as revelation, but as recognition, like something you've always known surfacing into language for the first time. She did not say it. She wasn't ready to say it. But she knew it, and the knowing was so clear and so complete that it was almost frightening. She stood up carefully and said, "I need to get this to a lawyer." "I know someone in the county seat," Jesse said, standing. Honest man, good with land records. You know a lawyer, she said. I've needed one a time or two, he said simply. I'll ride there tomorrow if you want. I'll go with you, she said. He looked at her. You sure? He said. It's a long ride. It's my land, she said. I'll go. He nodded once. They left at first light the next morning, Clara and Jesse, with the original 1851 agreement wrapped in oilskin in her saddlebag. Thomas had argued about staying behind, and lost, which he usually did when Clara had made up her mind. Send word when you get there, Thomas called from the porch. We'll be back by dark, Clara said. I know you will, Thomas said. Send word anyway. The ride to the county seat took 4 hours. They talked for some of it practical things, what the lawyer would need, what arguments Harlan's side would make. And for some of it, they were quiet in the easy way. They were quiet, and Clara was aware, riding beside Jesse through the dry Texas morning, that this right here, this ordinary ride, was the kind of thing she had never expected to have. Not the dramatic version, not the fairy story, just someone riding beside her who knew where she was going and why it mattered. The lawyer's name was Arthur Beale. He was 60 years old, thin as paper, with spectacles, and the carefully organized mind of a man who had spent a lifetime making sense of other people's chaos. He read the 1851 agreement twice, excused himself for 20 minutes, returned with 2 reference books and a county map, and then looked at Clara over his spectacles and said, Miss Whitmore, this document is unambiguous. The water rights are yours. Have been since your grandfather filed this in the territorial capital in 1851. He set it down. Whoever is challenging them either doesn't know this exists or is hoping you don't. The second one, Clara said. Beale nodded thoughtfully. Then we file a formal response with the county assessor, attach certified copies of this agreement, and request dismissal of the review. How long will that take? Jesse asked. 2 weeks, Beale said. Maybe 3 for the dismissal to be formalized. And in the meantime, Clara asked. In the meantime, Beale said, the review is on hold pending the response. Nobody touches your water. Clara looked at Jesse. Jesse looked at her. She thought, we're going to be all right. Not the whole future. Just right now, today, this specific battle. But sometimes that was enough. They rode home with the certified copies in her saddlebag, and the long afternoon ahead of them, and somewhere about 2 hours out from Millhaven. Jesse said, Can I ask you something? Yes, she said. What do you want? He said. Not the ranch, not the water rights, not the next problem to solve. He looked at her. What do you actually want, Clara, for yourself? She was quiet for a long time. She was not used to that question. She was used to want being something you managed down until it was small enough not to hurt when it was refused. I want to stop waiting for things to be taken away, she said. I want to get up in the morning and feel like what I'm building is actually mine. Not defended, not argued for, not justified. She paused. I want it to just be mine. Jesse rode beside her in silence for a moment. It is yours, he said. It has always been yours. Harlan Dodd can't change that. The bank can't change that. The town can't change it. He looked at her. The only thing that ever made you doubt it was people telling you to doubt it. And they were wrong. She looked at the road ahead. Her throat was tight. She didn't trust her voice immediately, so she waited until she did. You're very certain about things, she said. Only the ones worth being certain about, he said. She looked at him. I was watching the road, but there was something in the line of his jaw, the set of his shoulders, something that had been working its way toward the surface for a long time. Jesse, she said. My father told me what you said to him. After Harlan came the second time. He glanced at her. Which part? He asked carefully. That you were starting to recognize what you'd been looking for, she said. A silence. Long enough that the horse's hooves counted out a rhythm between them. He told me something too, Jesse said finally. What? He looked at her fully, then straight on the way he looked at things he needed to see clearly. He said if I intended to court his daughter, Jesse said, I should stop being careful and just do it, before she talked herself out of being receptive. Clara felt the heat rise in her face. "He said that," she said. "Those words," Jesse confirmed. "More or less." She looked at the road. "He's not wrong," she said. A pause. "No, ma'am," Jesse said. "He's generally not." Another silence. But this one was different, charged with something, full of something, the way certain moments fill up right before they change. Clara said very quietly, "So are you going to—" Jesse pulled his horse to a stop. She pulled hers too, and they were still on the road with the Texas afternoon all around them, and nothing but the distance and the sky. He looked at her with that settled, steady expression that she had learned was not restraint, but care, the way he held all important things carefully, because they mattered. "Clara Whitmore," he said, "I would like to call on you formally, with your father's permission, which I believe I already have, with the intention of—" He paused. "Of seeing where this goes, if you're willing." She looked at him. She thought about 24 years of being told she was too much and not enough simultaneously. She thought about the weight of that, how it had calcified over time into a kind of certainty. Not self-pity. She had never allowed herself self-pity, but a genuine practiced belief that certain things were not available to her. She thought about Jesse, who had come through her gate moving slowly because he understood that patience was respect. "I'm willing," she said. He nodded once, solemnly, the way he confirmed important things. Then he clicked his horse forward, and she rode beside him, and they went home in the long golden light of the Texas afternoon, and it was not dramatic, and it was not what she had imagined love would look like when she was young enough to imagine it. It was better than that, because it was real. They arrived back at the ranch to find Thomas on the porch with two of Pete Cavanaugh's men, and the expression on his face that she recognized immediately as carefully neutral, which meant something had happened that he was managing before she got there. She dismounted. "What is it?" she asked. Thomas looked at Jesse, then at Clara. "Harlan Dodd," he said, "was found this afternoon at the county assessor's office trying to file an amended claim, additional documents." He paused. "Except one of the clerks recognized the paper as new, not historical, not original." Clara went still. "He forged something," Jesse said. It wasn't a question. "Tried to," Thomas said. "The clerk flagged it. Called Arthur Beale. Apparently Beale is well known in that office. And Beale told them about your visit this morning and the 1851 agreement." Thomas folded his hands on his lap. "The county assessor is opening a formal inquiry into Harlan Dodd's submission." Silence. Clara processed this. "He forged documents," she said. "He tried to," Thomas said. "He's been so certain he'd win," Jesse said slowly, "that he decided to guarantee it." Clara looked at her father. Thomas looked back at her with that same expression, the one that saw her. "It's not over," he said. "Men like Harlan have lawyers and money and patience. But he made a mistake tonight." He paused. "And in this county, mistakes like that have a way of traveling." She stood in the yard. The evening was settling around the ranch, the cooling air, the cattle sounds from the south pasture, the creek running low but steady through her grandfather's channel. She had been up since before 4 in the morning. She had ridden 8 hours. She had sat in a lawyer's office and come home with something solid and documented and true. And now Harlan Dodd had overplayed his hand. Not finished. Thomas was right. Not finished. But shifted. Jesse came to stand beside her. Not touching. Just there in the way he was always there. "You should eat something," he said. "And sleep." "I know," she said. "Tomorrow it starts again," he said. "But tonight, it's just tonight." She looked at the sky, big and dark and full of more stars than she could count. She thought about everything she had been afraid to want. About a woman who had been told for 24 years that the walls around her were permanent. About the channel that had been buried for 60 years in the earth and still ran clean and true when someone finally believed it was worth digging for. She thought about Jesse Calloway, who had come through her gate moving slowly because he wanted her to know he could be trusted and had not once in 3 months given her a reason to think otherwise. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the sky too. His face was quiet. Everything about him was quiet, the particular quiet of a man who had been moving for a very long time and had finally in this yard on this ranch beside this woman stopped. "Jesse," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it." He looked at her for a moment. "Thank you for letting me," he said simply. She held his gaze, and then she went inside, and she sat with her father for a while, and she ate, and she went to bed. And for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, she fell asleep without the numbers running in her head, or the sound of threats she couldn't answer, or the weight of a town's cruelty pressing down through the dark. She slept like someone who had come home. And in the morning, she got up and went to work. And Jesse was already there. The county assessor's inquiry into Harlan Dodd's forged documents took 11 days. Clara knew because she counted them, not obsessively. She had too much work for obsession, but with the careful awareness of someone who understood that 11 days of legal process was 11 days of Harlan having access to lawyers and money, and the particular creativity of a man who felt cornered. She did not underestimate him. She had made that mistake once early on, when she had thought his first offer was simply greed, and not the opening move of something more systematic. She did not make it twice, so she worked. She checked the channel twice daily. She managed the herd. She sat with her father in the evenings and talked through the ranch accounts with the methodical patience of someone who had learned that numbers, unlike people, told the truth if you looked at them long enough. And Jesse was there, not intrusively, not performing, just present in the way he had been present since the beginning, a steady point in the landscape of her days, as reliable as the east fence and considerably more interesting. They had not spoken again about what had been said on the road from the county seat. They had not needed to. Something had settled between them with those words, "I would like to call on you formally," and the settlement was solid enough that it did not require constant confirmation. She knew where he stood. He knew where she stood. The rest would come in its own time, and neither of them was the kind of person who needed to rush the things that mattered. But she thought about it. She thought about it more than she intended to, and the thinking was not anxious the way her thoughts had been anxious for most of her life. It was something warmer than that. Something she was still learning to tolerate without immediately finding a reason to distrust it. On the 11th day, Arthur Beale rode out himself. She knew it was significant the moment she saw him. Lawyers sent letters. They rode out when the news was too large or too complicated for a letter to carry adequately. She brought him inside. Thomas was at the kitchen table better this week, more alert, insisting on being present for anything that pertained to the ranch, and Jesse stood near the door with his arms folded and his face composed. Beale sat down, opened his satchel, and laid 3 documents on the table. "The county assessor has completed its inquiry," he said. "The documents Harlan Dodd submitted were confirmed to be fraudulent. The paper was dated 1849, but the ink compound was inconsistent with materials available before 1870. He paused. Someone was careless or very confident they wouldn't be caught. Clara looked at the documents. "What does this mean?" Thomas asked. "It means," Beale said, "that the water rights assessment has been formally dismissed. Your 1851 agreement stands without challenge." He paused again, and this pause had more weight than the others. "It also means that Harlan Dodd is facing a formal fraud charge from the county. He has engaged legal counsel in Austin." Silence. Thomas let out a slow breath. "Will he fight it?" Jesse asked from the doorway. "He'll try," Beale said. "Men with his resources always try. But fraud charges of this nature are difficult to defend when the evidence is physical. The ink doesn't lie." He looked at Clara. "I want to be honest with you, Miss Whitmore. This process may take months. His lawyers will attempt to complicate it. But the water rights question is settled. Your ranch is not in legal jeopardy on that front." Clara looked at the documents on the table. She had been prepared for this moment for 11 days. She had rehearsed how she would receive the news steadily, practically, without the embarrassment of visible emotion in front of a lawyer and her father and Jesse. She had planned to say something measured, something that conveyed appropriate relief without excess. What she actually said was, "My grandfather built that channel 60 years ago because he believed in this land." Beale blinked. Thomas made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Yes, ma'am," Beale said gently. He did, and it held. Clara pressed her lips together. She nodded once very deliberately. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." After Beale left, Thomas looked at Clara across the table for a long moment. Then he looked at Jesse. "We're not losing this place," Thomas said. "No, sir," Jesse said. "Good." Thomas pushed himself to his feet slowly, with the careful dignity of a man who had made peace with his body's limitations without accepting them. "Then I'm going to lie down, because apparently being right about things takes more out of me than it used to." He moved toward the hallway, then stopped. He turned and looked at Clara. "Your grandfather would have been proud of you today. He'd have been proud of you every day if we're being honest. But today especially." She looked at him. "Get some rest, Papa," she said. He went. She sat alone at the kitchen table with Beale's documents in front of her. Jesse was still near the door, and she was aware of him, the way she was always aware of him, the specific gravity of his presence, the fact of him taking up space in her life in a way she had stopped trying to minimize. "It's over," she said, partly to herself. "This part is," Jesse said. She looked up. I was watching her with that careful expression, the one that lived between what he was thinking and what he chose to say. "There'll be other parts," she said. "Always are," he said. "That's not a reason to stop." She sat with that for a moment. "Jesse," she said, "sit down." He came away from the door and sat across from her, the same way he'd sat the morning they'd spread her grandfather's drawings on this table, and she thought about how much had happened since that morning, and how the table had held all of it, the plans and the fears and the letters and the ledgers, and now this. "I want to say something," she said, "and I want to say it plainly because I think you deserve plain things." He waited. "I have spent my entire life being told what I was worth," she said. "By this town. By men who looked at me and did the math and decided the answer was not much." She kept her eyes on his. "I believed them for a long time, not consciously. But in the way you believe things that are repeated often enough, the way they get into the air, you breathe until you don't notice you're breathing them." Jesse said nothing. "You changed that," she said. "Not by saying the right things. Not by being kind in a way that cost you nothing. But by—" She stopped finding the words. "By treating my judgment like it was worth something. By believing the channel would work when nobody else did. By staying when you had somewhere better to go." She paused. "I'm not good at this," she said. "You're doing fine," he said quietly. "What I mean to say," she said, "is that I am fully aware of what you've given to this ranch and to my father and to—" She stopped again. "To me. And I don't want to be a person who receives something like that and doesn't acknowledge it. Because that's a kind of cowardice I don't respect in other people, and I won't allow it in myself." Jesse looked at her across the table. A long, still moment. "Clara," he said. "Yes." "I know," he said simply. She blinked. "You know," she said. "I know what you're saying," he said. "And I know what it costs you to say it. And I want you to know that I don't need you to be good at this. I don't need the words to be perfect." He leaned forward slightly. "I just need you to be here, doing what you do, being who you are." He paused. "That's enough. That's more than enough." She looked at him. Her throat was tight again. She was absolutely not going to cry at her own kitchen table in the middle of the afternoon. She had very firm feelings about this. "You're going to be the end of me, Jesse Calloway," she said. "No, ma'am," he said. "I intend to be the beginning of something." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up because she needed to move before she said something she wasn't quite ready to say, and she said, "I'm going to check the East Trough," which was not remotely necessary because Jesse had checked it that morning and they both knew it. "All right," he said, not smiling, almost smiling. She went. The news about Harlan Dodd traveled through Millhaven, the way all news traveled by nightfall. It had reached every household, and by morning it had been embellished into something larger than the facts, but recognizable beneath the embellishments. Fraud charges. Forged documents. The county assessor involved. A prominent man who had apparently decided that the rules applied to everyone except himself, and had discovered at considerable cost that he was wrong. What surprised Clara was the town's response. She had expected indifference, possibly quiet satisfaction among those who had never liked Harlan. What she did not expect was Ed Garrity appearing at the ranch on a Friday morning with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that she had never seen there before. "I owe you an apology," Garrity said. She looked at him. "For what specifically?" she asked. "For 2 years ago," he said. "When you talked about the water channel at the feed store, I was one of the men who laughed." He looked at his hat. "That was wrong of me. You were right, and you had the knowledge and the sense, and I dismissed it because—" He stopped. "Because I was a woman," she said, "and a large one." He had the decency not to look away. "Yes," he said, "and that was my failure, not yours." She studied him. She had spent 24 years holding people's cruelties at a distance so they wouldn't destroy her. She had gotten very good at the distance. The apology sat at the edge of it, asking to be let in. She made a decision. "Thank you," she said, "for saying it." He nodded, relieved. "Is there anything?" he started. "You've already helped," she said. "The loan, that was enough." He put his hat back on and shook her hand directly, firmly, the way men shook each other's hands, and went back to his horse. She watched him go. Jesse appeared beside her. "You heard that," she said. He said. "What do you make of it?" she asked. "I make of it," Jesse said, "that Harlan Dodd did something you couldn't do yourself. He made this town look at you." She considered that. "By being corrupt," she said. "By being caught," Jesse said. "And by trying to take something from a person the town had written off. People don't like being wrong, but they like even less when someone proves they were wrong by trying to profit from it." He paused. "You were right about the channel. You were right about the water rights. You handled Harlan better than anyone in this county has ever handled him. People noticed that. They were just waiting for permission to say so." She was quiet. "I don't need their permission," she said. "No," he said. "But you might let them give it anyway. It doesn't cost you anything, and it might mean something to them." She looked at him sideways. "When did you get so philosophical?" she said. "Long trails," he said. "A lot of quiet time to think." She almost smiled. The following Sunday, Clara went to church. She had not stopped going to church. She had never stopped, but she had developed the habit of arriving exactly on time and leaving immediately after, minimizing the social territory before and after the service, where most of the town's cruelties had historically been delivered. She had made herself a small and moving target, and it had worked well enough. This Sunday, she arrived early. She stood on the steps and talked to people. Not performing, she was not built for performance, but present in a way she had not allowed herself to be in years. She answered questions about the channel system. She spoke to Pete Cavanaugh's wife, who had sent the preserved peaches, and thanked her directly. She spoke to 2 women she had always avoided because they were part of Margaret Pruitt's circle, and found to her genuine surprise that without Margaret's orchestration, they were simply women, nervous, ordinary, a little ashamed of the things they had participated in, and not quite sure how to say so. She didn't make it easy for them, but she didn't make it impossible either. Jesse stood slightly back the way he always did in public, visible, but not forward, available, but not intrusive. She was aware of people noticing him and noticing her and constructing a narrative, and she found also to her surprise that the narrative they were constructing was the right one. On the way home, she said, "That wasn't as bad as I expected." "It'll get easier," he said. "You've never lived in a small town long enough to know that," she said. "No," he admitted. "But I've watched you handle harder things than Sunday conversation." She rode beside him and thought about the woman she had been 6 months ago, the one who arrived exactly on time and left immediately after. The one who had learned not to want things because wanting was dangerous. "Jesse," she said. "When you said you wanted to see where this goes," she said. "How far are you thinking?" He rode for a moment without answering. She had learned not to fill his silences. They were always productive silences. "I'm thinking the full distance," he said finally. "If you're willing." She looked at the road ahead. The full distance, she said. Marriage, he said plainly, because he was a man who said plain things. Family. Building something that lasts longer than either of us. He glanced at her. I'm not asking yet. I want to do it properly when the time is right. But I'm not a man who talks around what he means, and I don't want you to be unsure of my intentions. She was quiet for a long moment. The horses walked. The Texas afternoon spread out around them, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. I'm not unsure, she said. He looked at her. No, he said. No, she said. I'm terrified. That's different from unsure. What are you terrified of? He said. She thought about how to answer that honestly. That I'll wake up one morning, she said slowly, and find out I misread the whole thing. That what looked like what felt like love was actually something smaller. Gratitude or proximity, or just the relief of having someone in your corner when things are hard. She paused. That I wanted it so much that I invented it. Jesse stopped his horse. She stopped hers. He looked at her across the small distance between them. Clara Whitmore, he said. I did not come to this ranch for gratitude. I did not stay for proximity. And I did not turn down a better-paying job in Colorado, because things were hard and you needed someone in your corner. He held her gaze with that steady, unperformed certainty that was the most recognizable thing about him. I stayed because you are the most remarkable person I have ever met. And because somewhere in the middle of a drought and a broken fence and a 60-year-old water channel, I fell in love with you. Not with the idea of you. With you. The actual, specific, stubborn, brilliant, frightening woman in front of me right now. She did not say anything. Because there was nothing to say. There was only the road, and the afternoon, and the sound of the horses, and Jesse's face, which was completely open in a way she had rarely seen from him. All of it right there on the surface, offered without protection. She thought, he means it. She thought, he has always meant it. She thought, I have been so afraid for so long that I almost missed this. Jesse, she said. Yes. I love you too, she said. Not dramatically. Not with her voice breaking. Just plainly in the way he said plain things, because that was what he deserved, and because it was true, and had been true for longer than she had admitted it. He looked at her. Something moved across his face that she had no word for. Not surprise because he had believed it, but something that looked like a man setting down something very heavy that he had carried a long distance. All right, he said. All right, she agreed. They rode home. They did not gallop. They did not race. They rode home at the same easy pace they had always used side by side. And Clara thought that this was exactly right, not a dramatic ending, but a beginning quiet and unannounced and entirely theirs. Thomas knew the moment they rode into the yard. Clara didn't say anything. She didn't have to. He looked at her face and then at Jesse's and nodded once slowly, with the expression of a man who has been proved right about something he cared about deeply. Supper, he said. Supper, Clara confirmed. They ate together on the porch in the cooling evening air. The three of them, the way they had been eating together all summer, and Thomas told stories about Clara's grandfather, that Clara had heard and not heard enough, and Jesse listened with the attention he brought to everything that mattered, and the night came in around them, easy and warm. After supper, when Thomas had gone inside and the dishes were done and the quiet had fully settled, Jesse said, I'd like to ask your father something tomorrow. Clara looked at him. I know you don't need his permission, he said carefully. I know that, but I'd like to ask him anyway, because I think he'd want to be asked, and because I think the asking matters. She looked at him for a moment. It does, she said. I thought so, he said. She went inside. She lay awake for a long time, looking at the ceiling, and she thought about all the years she had spent making herself small enough to fit inside the space the town had assigned her. She thought about the first morning Jesse had come through her gate, moving slowly, hat in hand, not knowing what he was walking into. She thought about her grandfather's channel, and her father's chest, and Harlan Dodd's ink that wouldn't lie, and Arthur Beale's spectacles, and Pete Cavanaugh's peaches, and Garrity's handshake, and the 1851 agreement that had held for 60 years because someone had believed it was worth filing. She thought things built right hold. She fell asleep. Jesse asked Thomas in the morning. Clara was in the barn when it happened. She had not planned to be in the barn, she had planned to be in the kitchen close enough to hear, but her feet had taken her to the barn instead, because some things were better received secondhand. Some things needed the space of a closed door between you and them, so that when the answer came, it had room to land. She waited. 10 minutes. 15. She was resetting a bolt on the gate latch. The same gate latch she realized distantly where she had first seen Jesse ride up the drive 4 months ago, moving slowly when she heard the porch door open and footsteps cross the yard. Jesse appeared in the barn doorway. She looked at him. His face told her before he said a word. "Well," she said anyway. "He said yes," Jesse said. Then, he also said, and I want to quote this accurately, that it was about time, and he was starting to think he'd have to say something himself. Clara closed her eyes briefly. "That sounds like him," she said. "He also cried," Jesse said. "Very briefly. He would like me to tell you he wasn't crying." "He was absolutely crying," she said. "Yes, ma'am." Jesse agreed. She opened her eyes. Jesse was standing in the doorway of her barn, with his hat in his hands, and the morning light was behind him, and he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had traveled a long distance to find the right place to stop. He reached into his shirt pocket. He took out something small and held it out to her. It was a ring. Simple. Silver. With a small stone she couldn't name. "It was my mother's," he said. "It's the only thing I have from before." She looked at it. She looked at him. "Jesse," she said. "Clara Whitmore," he said. "Will you marry me?" She thought about everything she had been told she was not. Everything she had been told she could not have. 24 years of a town's accumulated small violences, all of them amounting to one sustained argument. You are not enough for this. She thought about the channel running clean. She thought, built right. Holds. "Yes," she said. He put the ring on her finger, and she let him, and then she looked at it, this small silver thing that had belonged to a woman she would never meet, a woman whose son had carried it across 3 territories, without knowing who he was carrying it toward. She thought he knew before he knew. She looked up at him. He was watching her with an expression that had no performance in it at all. She stepped forward, and he put his arms around her the first time properly, without the excuse of proximity or work or crisis to explain it. And she pressed her face into his shoulder and stood there in her grandfather's barn, with the morning coming through the door, and the cattle in the south pasture, and the channel running in the east, and everything intact, and hers. "Thank you," she said, against his shoulder very quietly. "For what?" he said. "For moving slowly through the gate," she said. She felt him exhale, not a laugh, something better than a laugh. Something that started in his chest and didn't need a sound. He held on. She held on. And the ranch went on around them, the ordinary, difficult, irreplaceable work of it, and the summer began to turn toward fall, the way summers do in Texas. Not apologizing for the heat they'd caused, just moving on, and in their moving on, making room for something new. 3 weeks later, on an October evening, with the air finally cool, and the last of the summer's work laid down, Thomas Whitmore sat on his porch and watched his daughter and Jesse Calloway ride out to check the East Channel together, side by side, easy in each other's company, the way people are easy when they have found their particular fit. He sat there for a long time. The creek ran low but steady. The cattle were settled. The channel's 60 years of stone and faith, and his father-in-law's particular stubborn certainty that good work lasted ran clean all the way to the east pasture, the way it had run since the day they'd cleared it, the way it would run long after all of them were gone. Thomas looked at his daughter on her horse on his land. He thought about his wife, who would have had Jesse figured out in 10 minutes and would have been right. He thought about his father-in-law, who had built things to last and trusted they would. He thought about the morning this summer when Clara had come inside and said honest about a man who was still on his horse at the end of the drive. He thought she knew before she knew too. Clara turned her horse at the far fence and said something to Jesse, and Jesse tipped his hat and said something back, and even at this distance, Thomas could see the quality of the exchange, the ease of it, the rightness of it, the particular light that two people carry when they are exactly where they are supposed to be. He sat back in his chair. The evening came in around the ranch slowly. The way good things come, without announcing themselves, without asking to be noticed, just arriving and settling and staying. And Millhaven, Texas, which had spent 24 years telling Clara Whitmore what she was and was not worth, would spend the next 40 years knowing what it had almost missed. The woman they had called too much and not enough. The woman who had built a water channel out of her grandfather's faith and her own stubborn refusal to disappear. The woman who had looked a corrupt and powerful man in the eye and said, "This is mine." She had been worth it all along. They had simply lacked the sense to see it. But a cowboy had ridden through a gate one summer morning, moving slowly, hat in hand, and he had seen it immediately. And he had stayed. And that in the end, in the simple and irreducible truth of it, was everything.